The heavy silence in the mansion felt suffocating. Outside, the city buzzed, unaware that a legacy was about to crumble. Inside, everything had already shifted. Antonio Rizzoli, the head of the Rizzoli Mafia family, lay motionless, a crimson pool spreading beneath him. His eyes stared lifelessly at the chandelier above, his final breath having escaped his body in the same cold manner that defined his life. But as the clock ticked in the background, a hand, bloodied and trembling, reached out for a phone. The screen lit up, revealing the final message. "It's done. The king is dead. It wasn't supposed to happen like this." The family, the empire built from blood and steel, was suddenly on the brink of collapse. Was it revenge, or was it something far more calculated? What would follow would unravel everything. And now, with Antonio dead, the empire teetered on the edge of chaos, waiting for someone to take control. The news spread like wildfire. The king was dead, and chaos descended upon the family. The Rizzoli Empire, built on blood and betrayal, was now in jeopardy. The family members, once united in fear and loyalty, were now divided by suspicion and ambition. Giorgio Rizzoli, Antonio's eldest son, stood at the head of the table, his face a mask of cold determination. He wasn't the leader his father had been, but he was the only one left to hold the empire together. "We need to act fast," Giorgio said, his voice calm but firm. "There are vultures waiting to swoop in. We can't let the empire crumble." But his younger brother Marco wasn't so sure. Marco had always been the more emotional one, the one who questioned the family's ruthless ways. "Are we sure it was a good idea to kill Antonio? What if it wasn't a rival family? What if it was someone inside?" he asked, his voice filled with doubt. The tension in the room was palpable. The Rizzoli family had always been about power and control, but now it was about survival. Every word, every glance, every gesture was charged with the fear that the family was slipping from their grasp. As the Rizzoli family descended further into chaos, the fractures within their empire began to show. Giorgio's attempts to unify the family were met with increasing resistance, and Marco's doubts only fueled the fire. But the true betrayal came from an unexpected source. Late one night, as Giorgio reviewed the family's finances, a small envelope arrived at his doorstep. Inside, he found a letter, written in a delicate script, revealing shocking information. One of their closest allies, Salvatore Moretti, had been working with a rival family, feeding them crucial information. The realization hit Giorgio like a freight train. Salvatore had been part of the Rizzoli family for years. He had been Antonio's closest confidant and had even helped Giorgio during the transition of power. But now, it was clear that the very man who had sworn loyalty to their family was the one orchestrating their downfall from the inside. The betrayal cut deep, and Giorgio knew that the Rizzoli family could not survive another internal enemy. He would have to act fast, but the question remained, could they trust anyone now, or was the entire empire doomed? In the wake of the betrayal, Giorgio knew that there was only one way to regain control: an alliance with a rival family. The thought sickened him, but it was the only option left. Giorgio met with the head of the rival Luciani family, Carlo Luciani, at a secluded warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The two men stood facing each other in silence, the tension palpable. Carlo was a well-dressed man in his late 50s, his face lined with years of ruthless decisions. He had his own empire to maintain, and he saw an opportunity in the Rizzoli's collapse. "I don't like this, Giorgio," Carlo said, his voice low and calm. "But you have something I need: control of the Rizzoli family. Help me take out the remaining threats, and I'll ensure your family survives." Giorgio hesitated. There was no honor in making deals with the enemy, but he was desperate. His family was crumbling, and if aligning with the Luciani family was the price to save what was left, he would pay it. "You have a deal," Giorgio finally said, extending his hand. But deep down, he knew that no alliance with the enemy came without its cost. The alliance with the Luciani family had been formed, but Giorgio couldn't shake the feeling that it was a mistake. The Rizzolis had never needed to rely on anyone before, and yet now they were forced to live in the shadow of their former enemies. It gnawed at Giorgio's soul, and he began to question everything he had once believed in. One night, after a long day of dealing with the aftermath of the betrayal and new alliances, Giorgio sat in his father's study, staring at the portraits of Antonio and the old family leaders on the walls. The room, once a symbol of power, now felt like a tomb. The legacy of the Rizzoli family was slowly being eaten away by greed, betrayal, and power-hungry alliances. Giorgio's thoughts drifted to his father Antonio and the man who had built the empire. Had Antonio been betrayed as well? Had he seen the end coming before his death? Was that why he had built the empire so ruthlessly? Because he knew it would crumble one day? The questions lingered in his mind, but there were no answers. The king was dead, and with him, the certainty of everything Giorgio had known. As he stood up to leave, the weight of his father's legacy, and his own failures, hung heavily on his shoulders. The alliance with the Luciani family was crumbling. Giorgio Rizzoli knew Carlo Luciani's true intentions. He wasn't trying to save the Rizzolis, he was using them. Tensions escalated as Carlo took more control, leaving Giorgio's family weakened and vulnerable. Giorgio confronted his younger brother, Marco, over their next move. Marco hesitated, uncertain of their next steps. "We can't trust them," Giorgio said, his voice laced with frustration. "We need to take back control before it's too late." But Marco wasn't convinced. "If we make a move, it could end us. We're already on the edge." Days later, Giorgio learned the truth. One of their closest allies, Salvatore Moretti, had been leaking information to the Lucianists. The betrayal struck deep, and Giorgio knew the Rizzoli empire was crumbling faster than he thought. He confronted Salvatore, who confessed it's not personal, Giorgio. It's survival. In a cold fury, Giorgio demanded that Salvatore leave. "The family doesn't need your kind of loyalty." With the family in disarray, Giorgio realized that drastic action was needed. He gathered his remaining loyal men to strategize. "We can't just sit and wait for the Lucianas to take everything. We need to strike back, fast." But the risks were enormous. Giorgio wasn't sure if the Rizzolis could survive another war. The weight of the decision pressed down on him, but he knew there was no other choice. "We either fight now, or we're finished." Giorgio led an assault on one of the Luciani's key shipments, successfully intercepting it. The Rizzolis gained a small victory, but Carlo Luciani wasn't far behind. The Lucianas would retaliate, and Giorgio knew this victory was only temporary. Despite the success, Giorgio felt no sense of triumph. The war was far from over, and the Rizzolis had lost too much ground to recover easily. The Lucianas retaliated with brutal force. Within hours, they struck back, hitting the Rizzolis where it hurt the most, at their remaining strongholds. Giorgio's men were overwhelmed, and it became clear that the Rizzolis couldn't win this fight alone. Marco, watching the empire fall apart, suggested seeking help from outside forces. But Giorgio refused to negotiate with the enemy. "We fight or we die as a family," he declared. The war between the Rizzolis and the Lucianas raged on. The streets were filled with violence and bloodshed, and the city, once a symbol of power, was now a battleground. Giorgio had been prepared for the inevitable conflict, but nothing could have prepared him for the toll it would take on the family. Days passed in a blur of firefights and tactical maneuvers, and as Giorgio took command of his family's remaining forces, he saw the cracks in the foundation of the Rizzoli Empire begin to widen. The loyalty of his men was being tested, and the family's resources were running thin. The price of war was steep, and Giorgio could feel the weight of every life lost. In a rare moment of solitude, Giorgio stood alone on the rooftop of the mansion, staring out over the city. His mind raced as he tried to process everything: the betrayal, the violence, the loss. He knew that the Rizzolis would never be the same, and there was no going back. Giorgio received an unexpected visitor that night, his estranged uncle, Vittorio Rizzoli. Vittorio had been out of the picture for years, preferring the quiet life of a businessman rather than the dangerous world of organized crime. But now, with the family on the brink of collapse, he had returned to offer his help. "You're fighting a losing battle, Giorgio," Vittorio said, his voice calm but filled with concern. The Lucianis are ruthless. They'll stop at nothing to destroy you and your family. Giorgio, who had been losing control of his emotions, looked at his uncle with a mixture of frustration and disbelief. What do you want from me, Vittorio? You left us when we needed you most. Now you show up when everything's falling apart. Vittorio stepped closer, his eyes filled with regret. I never wanted this for you, but you need to understand, this war isn't just about territory. It's about survival. You're playing with fire, and you're going to get burned if you don't make a change. Giorgio didn't want to hear it, but deep down he knew his uncle was right. Family was losing, and it wasn't just the Lucianis who were a threat. There were enemies within, waiting for the right moment to strike. The following days brought a series of escalating betrayals. Giorgio received word from his most trusted lieutenant, Salvatore, that one of the family's most loyal men, Giovanni, had been working with the Luciani family all along. Giovanni, who had been with the Rizzolis for over 2 decades, was now exposed as a traitor. The revelation shattered Giorgio. Giovanni had been like a brother to him. To discover that he had been feeding information to their enemies from the inside was a blow that Giorgio could not easily recover from. Salvatore was furious, ready to take immediate action. But Giorgio knew this was a delicate situation. Giovanni had to be dealt with, but he didn't want the entire family to know just yet. Get Giovanni, Giorgio ordered, his voice cold. But don't make it public. This needs to be handled in silence. We'll deal with the rest later. Giorgio's trust in his inner circle had been shattered, and the walls that had once protected him were crumbling. The family he had spent his life protecting was falling apart, and the weight of the betrayal was becoming unbearable. As the betrayal of Giovanni sank in, the Rizzoli family began to fracture. Giorgio's grip on the family slipped as rival factions emerged, each with their own ideas on how to handle the Luciani threat. Some wanted to negotiate, some wanted bloodshed, and some simply wanted to flee the city before the Lucianis could finish them off. The disunity within the family only made Giorgio's position more precarious. He knew that the Rizzolis could not survive if they were divided. With the walls closing in, and the Lucianis pushing harder, Giorgio was forced to make a choice: lead the family through this crisis, or watch it crumble beneath his feet. His decision came swiftly. "We fight," Giorgio declared in a private meeting with his closest allies. "We show them that the Rizzolis are not a family to be destroyed. No more running, no more hiding." But Giorgio knew that the coming battle would be their most brutal yet, and the cost would be higher than he was prepared to pay. With the battle imminent, Giorgio sat alone in his father's study, staring at the portrait of Antonio Rizzoli that hung above the fireplace. His father had built the empire on blood and ruthlessness, but now Giorgio saw the true cost of that legacy. The empire had come to this: an empire built on betrayal, greed, and violence. Giorgio took a deep breath and made the decision that would change everything. He picked up the phone and dialed a number he had avoided for years. "Carlo," he said, his voice calm. "Let's end this. We meet tonight, you and me, one last time." It was a risky move. Giorgio knew it could cost him everything, but he had no other choice. The war was no longer just between families. It was a war for his soul. And Giorgio was prepared to sacrifice whatever it took to bring an end to this nightmare. The night was cold and silent as Giorgio made his way to the secluded warehouse. The city lights flickered in the distance, casting long shadows over the streets. This was the moment of reckoning. He had made the decision to meet Carlo Luciani face to face, away from the eyes of their families. There would be no intermediaries, no one to blame if things went wrong. It would be them, 2 men, a broken empire, and a battle for control. Giorgio entered the warehouse, his footsteps echoing in the emptiness. He could feel the tension in the air. Carlo was already there, waiting, his face as cold and unreadable as ever. The dim light from a single overhead bulb highlighted the hard edges of his features. "So, this is how it ends?" Giorgio asked, his voice steady but filled with contempt. Carlo stood from his chair, his movements deliberate. "You came here for answers, Giorgio. But what you're asking for, it's too late. The Rizzolis are dead, They've been dead for a long time. You just didn't realize it. Giorgio clenched his fists. You betrayed us, Carlo. All of it, everything was a lie. Carlo's lips curled into a faint smile. A lie? No, Giorgio. It was survival. Your family was never going to last. This empire was always doomed. Giorgio took a step closer. And now what? You think you'll walk away unscathed? Carlo's smile faded. You're not in control anymore. No one is. The only question left is whether you'll die for this empire or die with it. The standoff lasted for what felt like hours, neither man willing to make the first move. But Giorgio's patience was wearing thin. With a sudden motion, he lunged at Carlo, knocking him to the ground. The fight had begun. The two men exchanged brutal blows, each one trying to gain the upper hand. Giorgio, fueled by anger and betrayal, struck with a ferocity he hadn't known he possessed. Carlo, ever the strategist, fought back with calculated precision, aiming for Giorgio's weakest points. Blood was drawn, and the room was filled with the sound of grunts and crashing bodies. But despite the violence, there was a deeper struggle beneath the surface. This wasn't just a physical fight. It was a fight for the very soul of the family, a fight for control of everything they had built. Giorgio pinned Carlo to the ground, his breath ragged as he stared down at his former ally. It's over, Giorgio hissed. The Rizzolis will rise again. Carlo, gasping for air, smirked. You're wrong, Giorgio. It was never about the Rizzolis. It was always about power. And power has already shifted. As Giorgio stood over Carlo, preparing to deliver the final blow, a voice echoed from the shadows. Enough. Giorgio froze. The voice was familiar, but it didn't belong here. He turned to see Marco step into the light, a gun in his hand. His face was grim, his expression unreadable. Marco? Giorgio's voice cracked. What are you doing? Marco's gaze was steady, his hand firm on the gun's grip. I'm saving you from yourself, Giorgio. You're too caught up in this war. This empire, it's already lost. You're not going to win. Giorgio's heart sank as he realized what was happening. Marco wasn't here to help him. He was here to finish what Carlo had started. The betrayal ran deeper than he ever imagined. Marco, don't do this, Giorgio pleaded, his voice breaking. You're my brother. You're supposed to be with me. But Marco shook his head. I've been with you, Giorgio, but not anymore. This empire doesn't deserve saving. It's time for a new order. Giorgio's world had come crashing down. His brother, the one person he had trusted above all others, had betrayed him. The weight of the decision before him was unbearable. Marco was right. This empire was broken. The Rizzolis had failed. But could he really let it all go? Could he walk away from the only life he had ever known? In that moment, Giorgio made the most painful decision of his life. Do it, he said, his voice hollow. End it. The Rizzolis are finished. Marco's face softened for a moment, but the gun never wavered. I'm sorry, Giorgio, he said quietly, his finger tightening on the trigger. As the gunshot rang out, Giorgio's body went limp, and the world he had fought so hard to protect crumbled into dust. The aftermath of Giorgio's death was swift. The Rizzoli Empire, once feared across the world, fell into chaos. Without a leader, the family fractured into competing factions, each one vying for control. The Luciani family moved in, seizing what little remained of the Rizzoli's territory. Marco, now at the head of the Rizzoli family, watched as everything his father had built was destroyed. The cost of his betrayal was too high, and the empire that had once ruled the streets was now a shadow of its former self. As Marco walked through the ruins of the mansion, the weight of his choices settled on him. He had saved the family from collapse, but in doing so, he had condemned it to an even worse fate. The Rizzolis were gone, and in their place, nothing remained but ashes. With Giorgio's death, the Rizzoli family had plunged into chaos. The once feared empire was now a fragmented collection of rival factions, each one scrambling to fill the power vacuum left behind. Marco, the new head of the family, found himself at the center of a storm. His decision to betray his brother, though necessary, had left him with the heavy burden of leadership. The Luciani family had already begun consolidating power, picking off the remaining pieces of the Rizzoli empire. Every move Marco made seemed to be followed by another threat. His men were divided, and trust was in short supply. The family that had once ruled the city was now fighting for survival, torn apart by ambition and greed. One evening, Marco sat in his office, the weight of the empire's collapse pressing on his shoulders. He looked out the window, seeing the city that had been built by his father and his ancestors now slipping out of their control. "What have I done?" Marco whispered to himself. "The empire is gone, and I'm the one who destroyed it." As Marco continued to grapple with his role in the family's destruction, the Luciani family pushed forward with their plans to take full control. Carlo Luciani, always a step ahead, had already begun consolidating power in the streets and businesses once owned by the Rizzolis. His men patrolled the neighborhoods that once belonged to Giorgio and Antonio, sending a clear message: the Rizzolis were finished. Marco knew that if he didn't act soon, the Lucianis would swallow up everything. But he also knew that the Rizzolis were not the same force they once were. His power was fragile, and any move he made could lead to his own downfall. In a secret meeting with his most trusted allies, Marco laid out his plan. "We fight back. We take what's left of the empire and make them pay. We'll send a message to the Lucianis that we're not done yet." But his lieutenant Salvatore shook his head. "You don't understand, Marco. The Lucianis are too strong. This isn't just about territory anymore. It's about survival." Marco clenched his fists. "I'll fight to the end. I won't let them take everything my father built." Despite the overwhelming odds, Marco wasn't about to give up. Late one night, as he pored over intelligence reports, a breakthrough came. One of his men had discovered a weakness in the Luciani family's operations, a secret shipment of weapons that was set to arrive at a port under Luciani control. This was Marco's chance. If he could intercept the shipment, it would not only disrupt the Luciani family's plans, but also send a message that the Rizzolis weren't finished yet. With his loyal men, Marco set the plan into motion. As the night wore on, Marco stood at the docks, watching as the containers arrived. The tension was palpable, but he felt a surge of adrenaline. This was his moment to take control back from the Lucianis. As the shipment was unloaded, Marco and his men moved quickly. The ambush was swift and brutal. The Lucianis had been caught off guard. Marco's men took the weapons, destroying the rest. But as Marco stood amidst the wreckage, his victory felt hollow. It was a small victory in a much larger war, and he knew that the Lucianis wouldn't let this go. The retaliation from the Lucianis came swiftly. Within hours of the attack on their shipment, Carlo Luciani mobilized his forces and launched an assault on the Rizzoli family's remaining operations. The streets were once again filled with violence, as the Lucianis pushed forward with brutal efficiency. Marco's forces were spread thin, and the fight was becoming more desperate by the minute. In a frantic meeting with Salvatore, Marco realized that they were on the brink of total destruction. "We've lost too much ground. We can't win this," Salvatore said, his voice tinged with panic. But Marco refused to back down. "We have to fight. We can't let them take everything." As the gunfire echoed in the distance, Marco felt the walls closing in. The Lucianis were everywhere, and the Rizzolis were being squeezed into a corner. The empire that had once ruled with an iron fist was now a dying relic of its former self. The final battle was inevitable. Marco had tried everything he could to stop the Lucianis, but the family's grip on power had slipped too far. The Rizzolis were no longer a force to be reckoned with. They were a dying breed, fighting for scraps. As the Luciani forces surrounded the Rizzoli mansion, Marco knew that there was no escaping this fate. The empire was finished. Everything his father had built, everything Giorgio had tried to protect, was now lost. In the quiet of the mansion, Marco sat alone in his father's office, staring at the portrait of Antonio Rizzoli. The weight of his failure hung heavy on his shoulders. He had destroyed the family, his family. And for what? The final blow came in the form of a phone call from Carlo Luciani. "It's over, Marco. The Rizzolis are finished. Your empire belongs to me now." Marco didn't respond. He couldn't. The Rizzolis had lost. The empire had fallen. The Rizzoli family was a shadow of its former self. Marco, the last of his bloodline, stood in the ruins of their empire, a broken man in a broken world. The Luciani family had wiped them out, piece by piece, and now the city's underworld had been forever altered. In his quiet, empty mansion, Marco knew that the battle was not just for survival anymore. It was for redemption. He had no allies left. His family was dead or scattered, and even the few loyal men who remained had begun to question his leadership. The Rizzolis had no future, only a legacy of destruction and betrayal. But Marco wasn't ready to give up just yet. In the depths of despair, he had a single idea, a risky, dangerous plan. To take down Carlo Luciani and restore some measure of control to the Rizzoli name, Marco would need to go to the heart of the Luciani family's operations. He had to strike at their core, disrupt their foundation, and turn the tables. The stakes were higher than ever, and Marco knew the cost of failure would be his life. "This is the last chance," Marco whispered to himself as he paced the empty mansion. One last chance to destroy them. As Marco began to plan his final assault on the Luciani family, he knew that he couldn't do it alone. But trust was a luxury he could no longer afford. However, in a moment of desperation, Marco turned to an unlikely source: Vittorio Rizzoli, his estranged uncle. Vittorio had remained out of the family business for years, but Marco knew he was still a formidable force in the world of crime. There was a chance, however small, that his uncle could help him navigate the treacherous path ahead. They met in a secluded warehouse, far from prying eyes. The air between them was thick with tension, but there was an underlying understanding. "Why would you help me, Vittorio?" Marco asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. Vittorio leaned back against a stack of crates, his expression unreadable. "Because, Marco, you're the last one left. And despite everything, I owe your father something." Marco's eyes narrowed. "What do you want in return?" Vittorio smirked. "I want the Lucianis to fall, and I want a piece of what's left when it's done. You're not the only one with something to prove." Marco hesitated but then nodded. "We have a deal. Help me take down Carlo Luciani, and you'll get what you want." With Vittorio's help, Marco's plan began to take shape. They would infiltrate the heart of the Luciani family's operations, their main headquarters, an abandoned factory on the outskirts of the city. Marco had gathered a small loyal group of men, and they were ready for anything. But as the day of the assault drew near, doubt began to creep into Marco's mind. He had always relied on the power and legacy of the Rizzoli name, but now, with everything shattered, he was a man fighting on his own terms. There was no going back. In the final hours before the attack, Marco sat in the planning room, staring at the map of the factory. "This is it," he muttered to himself. "There's no turning back now." Vittorio walked in, his face grim. "I hope you're ready, Marco. Once we go in, there's no way out." Marco stood up, his eyes steely. "I don't have a choice anymore. If I die, I die with the Rizzoli name intact." The night of the assault arrived, and Marco and his men made their way to the factory under the cover of darkness. Every step they took felt like it could be their last. The factory was heavily guarded, but Marco had studied the layout for weeks, and they knew exactly where to strike. As they infiltrated the compound, Marco's mind raced. Every move had to be precise, or it would all fall apart. The sound of gunfire echoed in the distance as his men moved in, taking out the Luciani guards with ruthless efficiency. The final confrontation would take place in the heart of the factory, where Carlo Luciani himself waited, protected by his most loyal enforcers. Marco's heart pounded as they closed in on their target. This was the moment, the culmination of everything he had fought for. The empire, the betrayal, the bloodshed, all of it led to this. Marco stood in the center of the factory floor, facing Carlo Luciani. The once great leader of the Luciani family was now a shell of the man he had once been. His empire was crumbling, and his future was uncertain. "You shouldn't have come here, Marco," Carlo said, his voice low but filled with authority. "You were never going to win this. Your family is gone. This is my city now. Marco's eyes narrowed. You'll never control it. This is where it ends, Carlo. The two men circled each other, each one calculating their next move. The air was thick with tension as the sound of gunfire echoed in the background. Marco knew that this battle wasn't just about the city, it was about redemption. With a swift motion, Marco lunged at Carlo, knocking him to the ground. The fight was brutal, the two men clashing with every ounce of energy they had left. As Carlo struggled, Marco whispered, "The Rizzolis may be dead, but they will never be forgotten." In the end, it was Marco who stood victorious, his hands covered in blood. The Luciani Empire was broken, and Carlo Luciani lay dead at his feet. The Rizzoli family was no more. Marco stood over the ruins of the factory, the last remnants of the empire gone. The Lucianis had been toppled, but at what cost? The streets were no longer ruled by the Rizzolis, and Marco was left with nothing but ashes. The city that once trembled under their rule was now a fractured, lawless place. Marco's men were scattered, and the remnants of the family's fortune had been siphoned away by Carlo Luciani's people. He had avenged his family, but there was no victory, only a hollow feeling of loss. The fight was over. The Rizzolis were gone, and all that was left was survival. Marco stood alone in the city, now a stranger to it all. His actions had torn the heart out of the Rizzoli family, and now he had to live with the consequences. The price of victory was his soul. The battles, the betrayals, and the bloodshed had consumed him. He could no longer tell if he had won or lost. All he knew was that the empire was no more, and he was the last one standing. Marco's phone rang, breaking the silence. It was a message from the Underworld. Someone else had already moved into the vacuum left by the Rizzolis. The power struggle was endless. The empire he had tried to protect was gone, and the game was moving on without him. Marco's future was uncertain. All he had was the remnants of a legacy, but even that was fading fast. He could feel the weight of his father's legacy slipping through his fingers. The Rizzoli family would never return. Marco left the city, stepping away from the chaos he had created. The Rizzolis were gone, and he was no longer bound by the empire. The streets, once filled with ambition and violence, now seemed empty and distant. There was no return to the old world. No redemption. Just survival. Marco walked away from the wreckage, knowing that his past would never let him go. But the future, whatever it might be, was his to shape. As Marco disappeared into the night, the legacy of the Rizzoli family remained in ruins. The empire had crumbled, the streets were silent, and the world moved on. The war had ended, but the price of victory had been too high. And as Marco walked into the unknown, he knew that no matter where he went, the ghosts of the Rizzoli family would follow him. The empire was gone, but the scars remained.